Tonight, how much can we believe about the enemies of the United States? In Angola 10 years ago and in Nicaragua today, we hear accounts of communist expansion. But are such stories true? Tonight, two former CIA officers tell reporter Christopher Hurd how lies invented about Angola and Nicaragua found their way into the world's press. Two experienced journalists tell him the difficulties they've had telling fact from fiction. Some people call this process disinformation, others call it lying. The CIA just call it a standard technique.
The Sandinista dictatorship of Nicaragua, with full Cuban Soviet bloc support, not only persecutes its people, the church, and denies a free press, but arms and provides bases for communist terrorists attacking neighboring states.
As they, the saying that they have is that this has been said publicly, by the way, by a U.S. government spokesman, that our intelligence from Nicaragua is so good, that we can hear the toilets flush in Managua. And I've often thought that might be the source of some of this information.
Angola, a country at war. Rich in natural resources, as large as France and Spain together, a left-wing government, supported by the Cubans, fights a continual battle against a guerrilla army backed by the South Africans. 10 years ago, the Russians and their allies sent troops and guns into a continent where they had no right to be. According to the newspapers at the time, that's how the Angolan War started. Or did it? John Stockwell worked for the CIA for 12 years, rising to the rank of colonel. His last assignment was to run America's secret campaign in Angola.
We had set ourselves well above and beyond the law, beyond the Congress, beyond the Constitution. We were lying to the President, lying to the Secretary of State, lying to the Congress about what we were doing.
1974, the Portuguese Revolution. The end of centuries of dictatorship and oppression at home, and of Portuguese imperialism in Africa. But as the colonies gain independence, in the largest, Angola, three groups vied for control of one of the richest countries in Africa. Jonas Savimbi, a friend of Che Guevara, but now an anti-Marxist, led UNITA. Agostinho Neto, a Western-educated left-winger, led the MPLA. Holden Roberto led the FNLA. He had been on the payroll of the CIA for 14 years, so he was the obvious choice for the seasoned campaigners back in Washington.
The CIA had just closed down 3 long-term paramilitary operations in Southeast Asia. Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. They'd had over 1,000 paramilitary case officers come flocking back to Washington. They didn't have desks for everybody, much less jobs, and morale was rock bottom low. They wanted a covert action. They wanted a paramilitary encounter. Angola was convenient. There never was a study done of who's who in Angola, who would be best for Angola, who would be best for the CIA or for the United States, or what. There was no study done.
Well, the rationale was that the Soviet Union was trying to take advantage of the United States' weakness right after the Vietnam War, that Angola was getting its independence and they were trying to snap it up, and that Henry Kissinger decided that we could not be weak and we wouldn't let them do it. Our own files disproved that. We moved into Angola first and the Russians were responding to us.
But before the CIA could start a war on the other side of the world, in Angola, it needed the approval of the National Security Council, a key part of the American decision-making machine, where policy is made by the top men in the government and the military.
The first briefings on Angola literally went, gentlemen, this is a map of Africa. Here is Angola. And then they went on with a chart to explain there are 3 liberation movements in Angola. One of them is headed by Holden Roberto. He's the good guy. We've worked with him for years, and they use literally good guy. Then the MPLA is headed by this drunken, psychotic Marxist poet, Agostinho Neto. He's the bad guy. And they used exactly so to make sure that people understood. And then, you know, like I say, you pack off and go off to and they come in for the next briefing about Micronesia or somewhere. The superficiality of what I saw fat old men dozing off in subcommittee meetings of the National Security Council in which we were making decisions that were getting people killed. And I mean exactly the way students do in their 9 o'clock class, you know, propping themselves up and getting their glasses balanced so it won't look, you know, people can't tell if they're, and their heads nodding off. And then you'd have to wake them up sort of to get their concurrence on, so I explained something to them again.
But the newspapers contain nothing about the fascinating way in which policy was made. Instead, they fell victim to Stockwell's worldwide campaign of disinformation.
The basic theme was to make it look like a Russian and Cuban aggression in Angola. And so any kind of story that you could write and get into the media anywhere that pushed that line, you did. 1/3 of my staff in this task force was covert action, was propagandists whose professional career jobs was making up stories and finding ways to get them into the press.
From the CIA's headquarters, Stockwell put his propagandists into London, Lisbon, Lusaka and Kinshasa. From the safety of such cities, none of which are actually in Angola, they wrote press releases for the FNLA and UNITA, which were fed into the ticker tapes of the Western media. The propagandists assiduously courted Western journalists, briefing them and wining and dining them. His man in Lusaka was particularly enthusiastic.
He ran a story that the city of Malanje had been captured by the UNITA forces.
And in doing so, it captured 20 Russian advisors. And they thought this would show that Russians were running the thing in Angola. There weren't Russian advisors. It wasn't a factor, and we knew that.
So I went to the British Museum's newspaper library to see how successful Stockwell had been. And here's the story in The Guardian, under the headline, UNITA captures 20 Russians. The UNITA statement, with all its convincing detail, is quoted at length. And according to this, there were 500 Russians and other mercenaries involved in the battle, and there were 2 tanks and 3 armoured cars, and even a house full of arms of Russian make. The Guardian put quotes around the headline to show they weren't quite sure of the story, and presumably that's why they put a question mark after this hopeful little piece. The Malanje story also made it to the front page of the Times, which quotes UNITA's claim that they captured 20 Russians in the battle for Malanje. The Times clearly believed UNITA because they helpfully tell us that Malanje used to be under the control of the MPLA. The source for this story was the Reuters correspondent in Lusaka.
I remember reporting that very clearly, and I should stress I was not the only journalist to report it. Many of us reported it, and we pinned it on an official UNITA communique. But years later I discovered that a little CIA misinformation expert had sat in the US Embassy in Lusaka and had composed that communique, and it bore absolutely no relationship at all to truth.
When you reported it, did you think it was true?
I had absolutely no idea. I mean, you've got to remember at that stage, during a war, you're working under incredible pressure. I worked for 4 months without a day off for 16 hours a day. And all that was wanted was a flow of information. I mean, I'd done the same in the Middle East War. I was based in Damascus. And in the first week of the war in Damascus, I wiped out the Israeli Air Force 3 times over, with official statements.
Reuters is one of the world's largest news agencies. Its offices around the globe provide many papers with their only source of news from some parts of the world. Many papers actually rely on the same person for their information, the Reuters correspondent.
Well, I mean, with hindsight, some of the official statements from the side I was reporting, and I stress from the side I was reporting, but also from the side that people in Luanda with the MPLA were reporting, clearly most of those statements were completely false.
Most of them were completely false.
I would think so, yes.
Doesn't that mean that for the average reader we received an absolutely impossibly distorted view of what was going on?
I think that's a very fair assessment.
But newspapers were hungry for stories, and one of Stockwell's propagandists fed them well.